SDG 1 sets out some very ambitious and wide-ranging targets. In this slide, we have summarized some of them in abbreviated form. The first two targets shown are clear. They aim to reduce poverty. The third and fourth address the means to achieve poverty reduction. These are points at which trade and international market integration can be influential. In particular, we focus on the trade-related aspects of the target of mobilizing resources that provide the means to end poverty. And we note that in order for resource mobilization to be effective in lifting the poor, they must have access to the resources needed to take advantage of opportunities for growth. How do governments typically go about attacking poverty? In their classic 1989 book Hunger and Public Action, the economists Jean Drezé and Amartya Sen identify two types of approaches. The first is protection policies. These are measures intended to ensure adequate consumption without addressing the causes of poverty. Cash transfer schemes, for example, fall into this category. The second is promotion policies. These are structural measures that increase the quantity, value, or productivity of poor people's assets, thereby increasing their earning power and their wealth. How does trade enter the poverty policy picture? Trade alters asset prices and may promote productivity-enhancing investments. Thus, trade may influence the success of promotion policies. Indeed, it is reasonable to think of trade as one type of promotion policy. How can trade reduce poverty? Let's consider the mechanisms through which trade influences the lives of poor individuals. In practical terms, to be in poverty means either that someone lacks the assets, such as land, labor, or skills required to produce for themselves, or that the market does not value these assets, or what they can be used to produce, enough to ensure adequate income. So we can see that the main effect of trade is through the valuation of productive assets, especially the principal asset of the poor, their labor. Trade has secondary effects also, on consumer prices and indirectly on productivity. But its main effect is through changes in the structure of production and employment. Real investments raise productivity, which has several implications for poverty alleviation. The increased productivity enhances the opportunity to earn foreign exchange through exports, improves wages and employment, and may have spillover productivity benefits to domestic firms. In lower-income countries, international markets are a key source of new investment, that is, through FDI. This applies to greenfields investments, that is, the creation of new productive assets, rather than to financial investments, which are purchases of existing assets such as stocks and bonds. Lower-income countries are distinguished by the scarcity and thus high cost of all forms of capital. The rest of the world, in contrast, is more capital abundant. FDI is a way to match an abundant domestic resource with one that is abundant elsewhere, thus raising domestic labor productivity through increases in labor demand. Besides, FDI is often bundled with technologies and enhances labor productivity even further. Investment, more than any other international linkage, has the power to directly increase employment and labor productivity and thus wages. So long as complementary conditions exist, it is a high-powered mechanism for poverty alleviation and economic growth. Many studies document the positive impacts of foreign direct investment on employment and earnings in the developing world. The benefits aren't only direct, they also take the form of positive spillovers to domestically owned enterprises in neighboring or related businesses. Because of the capital and other innovations that they bring, foreign invested enterprises typically show higher labor productivity and thus offer higher wages relative to equivalent domestic firms. Where the foreign direct investment presence is large enough, these benefits also spill over into local labor markets, lifting wages and productivity across the board. These increases in productivity and wages are among the targets of SDG 8. Several empirical studies confirm this claim. A research paper by Frederick Sjörum and Robert Lipsey in 2006 shows that manufacturing firms with foreign ownership pay about 30% more wages to blue-collar workers than domestic-owned firms. Another study by Alexander Hedgeson and his team in 2013 also finds that a change of ownership from domestic to foreign earners leads to higher wages, particularly in developing countries like Brazil and Indonesia. Lastly, Sune Carlson and his team discover in their 2009 research paper that foreign direct investment in China also creates about 5 to 8% more employment among private domestic firms. We now turn attention to another fundamental sustainable development goal, that of reduced inequalities. SDG 10 targets constitute an ambitious agenda for inclusive growth, starting with the target of ensuring that the incomes of the poorest 40% of households grow faster than the national average. Other targets are instrumental to that goal: equal opportunity, lack of discrimination, labor mobility, and more. At first glance, the targets of SDG 10 seem to imply a strictly domestic policy agenda. But we know that trade and FDI can exert substantial influence over domestic economic circumstances, not least labor markets. So, are trade and FDI compatible with the reduced inequality agenda? The answer is potentially, and even probably, yes, but as expected, the influence of trade in redistributing income is necessarily limited. Income inequality evolves slowly, even over generations, and is subject to many influences. Most important among these is the distribution of ownership of productive assets such as land, capital, and labor. Trade alters the values of these assets but has little influence over the distribution of their ownership. Similarly, fiscal policy plays a redistributive role but is largely unaffected by trade.